Well, hello and welcome to another glorious episode of Pod of the Gaps. I am Aaron Edwards, returning from my auspicious absence from the last episode. I'm joined here by Andy Bannister. We have another absentee, don't we? What's his name?
We do to go. Well, this obviously is sort of holiday kind of season. So Michael Otts has disappeared off, and is Michael's sort of habit. He is, I think, in a tent somewhere in the far northwest of Scotland, without Wi-Fi, without electricity, without running water, without sunshine, and wherever. So very brave kind of holiday. So we are holding the forts.
So if we see him tweeting or Facebooking, we'll know we're being lied to.
Yes, I have wondered whether actually he's in a luxury 5-star hotel in Barbados and just bigging it up and pretending that he's on some manly holiday.
He could be committing podcast adultery or something. He could be, going and doing a rival podcast, and we wouldn't even know, would we?
Yes, exactly. Well, it depends how many people listen to that podcast, but maybe he's just podcasting to himself. But
that's true.
But looking at your background, and again, listeners at home or wherever, you only get the audio; they don't get the full Technicolor effect of actually we seeing each other on video. But you look like you're not in your office. You're not on holiday or in a tent, but that is not your regular office. What's going on, mate?
Yeah, well, it's funny you should say that. And you know what? That sounds like a setup, but you don't actually know why. I did tell you.
I don't. You did say ask, so I'm asking.
Yeah. That's right.
For listeners, we do rehearse briefly where the intro is going to go, and then we go down a series of different and unconnected rabbit holes. But yes,
they would never think that. They would never think we go down rabbit holes, would they, on this show? So I go into my office earlier this week, having been on leave, not checking my email, so I don't know anything that's happened over the last 4 weeks. And 2 Indian people just popped their heads in my office halfway through as I'm getting through my long pile of emails, catching up, and they're saying, "Oh, we're filming in here now." And I was like, "I don't think you are." But yeah, this is where we're filming. He's like, "What are you filming?" Like, "Oh, the movie." I was like, I don't think I agreed to be in any movie.
Is it your life story? Is that what it is? Like... You finally made it.
This is your life. Yeah, that's right. And I was like, this is odd. Is there some interview set up? Has there been something that's been arranged? I think, can you just tell me, who are you kind of like accountable to? Can you go and get them to come and talk to me? And literally tonight, then the operations director of the college comes and says, "Oh, how did you didn't get the email?" I was like, "No, I don't check email on leave, as one shouldn't." I said, "Well, we've actually converted the entire college site into a Bollywood movie set." And I was like, "You literally couldn't write this. Not even in a Bollywood movie script could you write this series of events." So literally, in the space that I was on leave, a Bollywood movie company approached the college in some circumstances of needing a venue to film a movie based in a school. I don't know why it had to be in this area, but it did. Maybe because Tom Cruise is filming just down the road in one of the scenes in Mission Impossible. So I wondered if there's something to do with that, but it's very odd. So literally now they're converting the whole site into like an Indian school for the next 3 or 4 weeks.
So this is going to be one of those sort of typical Bollywood sort of movies, boy meets girl very chastely with lots of dancing and sort of colourful costumes, but in Derbyshire rather than in India.
Yeah, I may or may not be using my office, as a dancing venue.
It does tell me though that maybe you should reverse the favour and to go, if ever Pod of the Gaps becomes really huge and someone wants to film the story of your life, they need to recreate Cliff College, in Mumbai.
That's right,
or somewhere.
Cliff College, Bollywood. Yeah. So little did I know I was the only faculty member on site at the time because you weren't allowed to be on site, and I just wandered into my office as normal.
I think it's a wind up. I think the rest of them in their absence were like, "Okay, how can we prank Aaron Edwards? Right. Okay, let's see if we can convince him." So they've actually just hired 3 blokes to pretend to be Indian filmmakers, and actually the rest of your colleagues are back on campus.
But now that's the way of getting rid of me. It's a great way to fire someone, just gradually, just to sort of. The movie's still going on 3 years later.
3 years on and whatever. So there we go.
Anyway, so that's why
I really can't equal that in terms of my week.
No, but you did have some drama, didn't you?
We did have drama, and not of the Bollywood variety. We were supposed to record this podcast kind of yesterday. And literally sort of 15 minutes before I was due to sort of dial in to you and set this up. My son, I was down the local park with my son, my 6-year-old decided to do an experiment. He decided to see what happens if you run at high speed and try and jump between the chains of a moving child's swing. And what actually happens in his case is your left foot, as it comes through, catches it. You do this sort of dramatic mid-air roll, land on your shoulder, and break your collarbone. So the poor little guy has broken his collarbone. So he's wandering around very. Actually, he was very sad. I was just saying before the show, he was looking very morose at breakfast with his arm in his sling. And we said, "Are you all right, buddy? Is it sore?" He went, "Oh no, I'm frightened." We said, "What are you frightened about?" He said, "I'm afraid my arm's going to fall off." So we had to sort of pull up a picture of a human skeleton on the computer and sort of show the bone structure and go, "You actually have lots of other bones holding your arm. It definitely won't fall off." But apparently, I think his sister had put this idea into his head. So
Right, okay.
8.5-year-old sisters can be really helpful.
What are big sisters for in such moments? Exactly. Oh, well, there you are. Yeah, well, excellent. Well, there's how do we make a tenuous? There's probably a tenuous link from my story.
Things falling off, things declining, things falling apart.
Things declining, yeah, things changing, things being invaded. I don't know. Well, either way, whatever the tenuous link would be, we'll ask the listeners to send in the tenuous link for this week because it's very tricky to find all between Bollywood, A Dislocated Shoulder, and our theme. Drumroll, please. Is Western culture getting worse? Is Western culture getting worse? And we're talking obviously about the decline, the general decline of the sort of civilization known as the West or Western culture. And it's something that we've, people have been speaking about quite regularly on various other podcasts and in newspapers, reports, and all this kind of thing over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, perhaps, but especially ramping up in the last 2 or 3 years. There has been these narratives of what's going to happen in the future. There's all sorts of wonderful things, of course, about Western culture. There's lots of great things that you could point to as saying this is progress. There's been some excellent, advances in scientific discovery and healthcare and various sort of ways in which cities and towns are related to one another, or nations relate to one another. There are clearly advances which are helpful and good. You think the very people who are writing about how terrible the West is will also be ordering books from Amazon or other providers, but probably don't come as quick as Amazon, that arrive the next day or the same day. And you think, gosh, what a bizarre situation we live in where we can have access to so much stuff, to so much information. But with all of that, clearly there are many other issues. We've pointed to many on this show. There are significant problems with how the West understands itself and what the fears are for the next generation. And so this has all sorts of implications. It goes into various sort of areas. I'm going to try and get into some of these today. But I thought, Andy, maybe you can kick us off, seeing as you're the only one I can ask to kick us off, because Michael has kicked himself off this week in his tent in Scotland. Where do you see this sort of starting out or going to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it, Aaron? I think one of the first things I'd say is I think when you live within a culture, it's very easy to assume that it's monolithic and will always be there. And one of the things that you and I, of course, were talking about before the show began, we were sort of, catching up on what we're reading this summer. We all love, both you and I, one of the interests we have in common is reading old books. And of course, reading old books is interesting because you get a perspective from a different generation and a different era. And that reminds you that things don't have to be the way they are. But for many of us who live our lives right in the moment, we just watch on TV now, we just engage with what's on Netflix now, what's on social media now. We forget the culture's rise and culture's fall. I mean, there have been plenty of cultures in history who thought they were the absolute, bee's knees, or the joint of another insect, if you prefer. Other insects are available. The Romans really thought they were it, the Greeks, the Persians, the Islamic Empire at its height, and so on and so forth. And for a long time, I think the West has sort of naively assumed, well, we're it, right? We are the triumph of human civilization. Look how amazing we are. And there was this sort of thinking that, well, the rest of the world is going to copy us, right? Everyone's going to drink Pepsi, everyone's going to watch Hollywood movies, everyone's going to believe in human rights and democracy, and we'll achieve global hegemony and everything will be wonderful. And we're suddenly beginning to discover that actually the West is actually looking increasingly tired. And there are many voices beginning to argue that maybe that cultural momentum was naive to assume that. I mean, perhaps the most recent example of it, we talked about this on the previous podcast while you were, relaxing on the beach somewhere, was what's happened in Afghanistan. I mean, who would have thought that the Western powers would pump, 20 years and all their military experience and billions of dollars in and fail. And that's exactly what's happened. And at the same time as well, and we can, perhaps we can dive deeper into this in a moment, but at the same time as well, Aaron, of course, we have other civilizations who are younger and more energetic, and the young upstarts, as it were, looking at the old dinosaur, going, right, maybe it's time to, heave this one off the stage. The most likely candidates out there would be, civilizations like China, I think, which is, very much the emerging superpower. You've also got to not far behind. You've got India, I think, which huge population. But look at the technological expertise that's now centered.
Well, you see that. I mean, India's clearly invading other people's colleges to make Bollywood movies.
Yeah, exactly. Gone are the days of Hollywood filming on location in India. India's now filming on location in Derbyshire.
That's
and then, of course, you've also got older empires that perhaps we thought we had triumphed over, and that maybe we were a bit too hasty. Look at Russia and so forth, that I think we've neglected. And I think the assumption that the West is going to be, driving things culturally for the next 100 years, I am not convinced I would bet on that proposition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, isn't it? As you say, that there's all of these other, you might say, pretenders to the throne. There always is a kind of civilizational leader. Empires are always sort of with us in some ways. It almost seems to be part of civilizational human nature, you could say, regardless of whether they understand themselves as an empire. Like, there is no such thing as the empire of the West or the empire of the USA, but quite clearly it is. Functionally speaking, it is imperial in the sense that people see themselves as paying deference to it. The dollar being the significant currency, or as the pound still is really from its own time in the sun, as it were, under the British Empire. And that the kind of loss of confidence that you mentioned there is important as well. The tiredness. That there's just at that time, I think there's a Solzhenitsyn quote I saw going around social media recently. Him saying this at the kind of height of the threat of at the height of the Soviet Union in its kind of all of its glory, as it were, or inglory, saying, actually, you may feel tired about defending the West or defending the values that you hold dear, but the communists are not tired at all. They've got a lot of energy and they're wanting to continue pushing. Now, of course, we saw that didn't happen in what was the Soviet Union, but other forms, other ideologies, and other civilizational approaches will be in their ascendancy elsewhere. And you mentioned Afghanistan, a really important one situation here, kind of a microcosm of everything that's sort of gone wrong, really, with how the West sees itself, its sort of global influence, and trying to kind of police the world or try to set right its what it sees as the problems elsewhere. And it's interesting to see the debate recently on that there's even an openness now to talk about, well, that maybe the Taliban aren't so bad, that kind of thing, which does itself speaks into, I know there's complexities to that debate, but it speaks into maybe our loss of judgment, or the fact that we ourselves have gotten so used to being open to so many different things that we've almost fragmented ourselves in how we understand truth. And this is something that many writers over the last sort of half century even have sort of noticed. There are many that we could bring to mind, but it's certainly something that comes up a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, as so many things I could say there. I mean, one of the first things I find interesting is that that line you used there about losing confidence. There's a lot going on there. One of the reasons I think we've lost confidence, we've talked in previous episodes about the rise of kind of sort of wokeism. And the word woke is everywhere, which is this sort of worldview that purports to make the West, and particularly kind of white males, to blame for absolutely everything that's gone wrong. And of course, so one of the big whipping boys today has become imperialism, and so this tendency to kind of beat up the West and the UK particularly, because of the our imperial adventures that we had. There's a lot of beating up on the past and sort of being very negative about some of what was done. And I appreciate some of that, because there was stuff done in the past that was horrendous. But a couple of things I think are missed in that. One, I think, is, of course, recognizing that there was a lot done that was amazing. Secondly, is the fact that you forget that if you hack away at your foundations long enough, there are going to be implications. If you go out to the garden and there's a big oak tree there, and you keep every so often going off and hacking at the roots with an axe and pouring bleach all over them, eventually that tree is going to die and fall over and take your roof out in the process. But then the other thing I find ironic, Aaron, is that we miss the fact that something you said I think is really helpful, that empires will always be with us. I think people are very naive if they think, well, okay, we can chase the West out and we could attack, the West for its imperial ambitions in the past, and maybe sort of ghost of empire around today. And then in its place will come, rainbows and kittens and fluff and whatever. Well, no, because empires will always be where there's all that will happen is another empire in its place. And so it's not a case of, shall we have will we have an empire or there not be an empire? The question really for the future is which empire.
Yes.
And I think what's interesting is I think we're very naive if we assume that the empires that will step into perhaps the shadow of the West, like say China, will go, you know what, the West got human rights right. We love what went on in the West. We'll make sure when we get greater share of global power that we bring the same attention to human rights as the West. I don't think that's likely to happen. And then the last thing that interested me, and then come back at me on this or take this where you want to. It's interesting how everything connects. That point you made about, I think, part of that loss of confidence has been we've lost confidence in our values, actually, and the values that built the West that were largely Christian, Judeo-Christian ones. That we've talked about this on so many previous episodes, that the idea of human value and dignity is profoundly Christian idea. It was not found in the civilizations that came before us. But now with this loss of kind of confidence and moral confidence where, everything we equivocate across, like you say, the Taliban, maybe they're not so bad, and so on. And it just reminded me, we were talking a moment ago about old books.
Yeah.
And I was sharing how one of the books I'm reading is a writer I've mentioned several times on the show in the past, F.W. Boreham, Baptist minister in New Zealand and Australia in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. And I was reading a little essay by him the other day called When All the Cats Are Grey. And he opens by saying, a French proverb, which Alexandre Dumas uses as the title, one of the chapters of the Three Musketeers, affirms that at night, all cats are grey. And he goes on to unpack the idea and use it as a metaphor for when there's no light shed into a situation, you can't tell the difference. Is that your cat sitting on the fence?
Yeah.
Is it next door's cat? Because all cats are grey. And of course, when the light of the gospel is turned off in a culture, then I think everything actually becomes grey. We do lose all bearings. And Friedrich Nietzsche famously talked about this in the parable of the lantern, the madman. That actually, when the horizon is washed away, there is no up, there is no down, there is no left or right, all bearings are gone. And I think that's what's going on in the West. We live in a culture that's profoundly lost its moorings, and it no longer knows which cat is which, doesn't know which direction is which. And it can no longer, ironically, for all the talk about justice, really talk about good, evil, right, wrong, just and unjust. There's a huge need for Christians to be salt and light in a culture like this.
Absolutely. No, that's a really, really important point. I think we, as you say, we talk a lot about the Christian foundations, the relationship between the West and Christianity. It's not as simple, for example, as just saying, well, we are a post-Christendom culture, so let's embrace the fact that we don't have the power anymore as the church, and we never should have had it anyway, and everything went wrong when the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian and ultimately led a series of decisions that led ultimately to Christianity being the sort of standard religion within the Roman Empire, and that it was inherited by the West. All those sort of ideas, we won't go into all those now, but we do need to recognize that there's an inheritance there, as you say, like the oak tree, which we're pouring bleach on, chopping away. A lot of the things embedded within Western culture are actually Christian ideas as well, fundamentally. And so it's easy for Christians to sit on their oak tree and say, oh, I really loathe Western culture. It's not about culture. It's just about us preaching the gospel per se. But well, in a way, lots of the values in Western culture are the results. They're the fruit of the preaching of the gospel. As you say, there's so many things which have been embedded, institutions and sort of values and ideals, which are literally the fruit of Christians changing the world. And so it should be a wonderful vision for the church to go, right, we want to be the kind of community that is being salt and light, as you say. And mentioning that the connection to Nietzsche and the ideas as they filter down made me think about this really wonderful book that I've returned to again recently called, I'll show it on the video just for Andy, because he's,
you're such a professional.
It's perfect.
Never work with children, animals, or theologians.
Exactly. You never know what could happen. We could be on a Bollywood movie set. We could not be. You never know. We could be actually in one right now. You don't know, Andy. You might be part of a scene that's being filmed. You never know. and I haven't even asked you for your rights. Anyway, the book that I would have shown you if we were a film podcast was Ideas Have Consequences. Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. And it's actually a book that was written in 1948. And if you read it, it's actually unbelievable how on the money it is for the things it's describing that we're seeing the true fruit of now. So he's talking about ultimately the inheritance of what's already happening from the 19th century into the 20th. And he's seeing what's happened in the First and Second World War. He's seeing the sort of malaise of the 1920s and people kind of giving up their ideals. And he's seeing the sort of loss of what we call metaphysics, this idea that there are really ideas, that there are ideas beyond ourselves. There are things beyond just empirical, material reality. So when we stop believing that there are things like love and truth and justice above us, and that are almost eternal values, lots of stuff goes wrong. And it takes a time for that to work itself out. But he sort of maps it out in education, in law, in art and culture, and the kind of fragmentation that happens in a society when we stop believing that truth really matters and has something to say to us as individuals. So I know we would say that as Christians a lot. We'd say, oh, there's a loss of truth in the culture. No one cares about truth because of postmodernism. Everyone's relativistic. But he says similar things, but in a way that gets at it at a bit of a deeper level, even though it's not an overly academic book. I mean, he's clearly very well read, and he was himself a professor. It's not like it's overly difficult to kind of get through. It's not overly footnoted, but it's very, very winsome and insightful. At times, very wonderful rhetoric in it as well. But it's really strongly making this point that we've lost the ability in the West to make judgments. We're so committed to, let's say, democracy, purely per se, that everyone should be equal in every possible manner. He said, yeah, that's a kind of good ideal in a way, but when we take that to a kind of extreme, we almost lose the ability to make any judgment. And so there's no such thing as hierarchy, because we hate hierarchies because they're always bad, because we've seen what men did to women or white people did to black people. So let's get rid of the idea of hierarchy. And said, well, that's again a nice thing to do in theory, but it really ends up in meaning that we can't say that things are true and not true anymore. We end up saying that there's something that's more valuable than something else. We can't say that anymore. We have to say that everything's kind of equally, relatively valuable. So this works itself out by fragmenting. We no longer have a sort of central idea of stuff we believe in. We sort of, everyone each to their own, egotistically is getting on with their own individual expressions of life. And we talk about that in loads of other examples. Carl Trueman's book, The Triumph of the The Triumph of the Modern Self. Yeah, and the kind of personal freedom of expression being the sort of fundamental, expressive individualism being the sort of fundamental way we understand ourselves. And you think, well, that's all happening. That's been happening that was written 75 years ago. And as I say, if you read through some of the quotes, you think, goodness, it's like he wrote it yesterday, like he wrote it this afternoon, because we're seeing it now with the kind of woke revolution, which is really only the last sort of 3 or 4 years. That's a flowering of everything. We're seeing what's happening now is what we used to joke about could happen if you took things to their logical conclusion. Men could become women, and then you'd be told off for saying that they couldn't become women, and this kind of thing. We're seeing loads of those sort of things happen all the time, a kind of gender bending, but also the sort of a love of indecency and obscenity almost is becoming more and more tolerable to people within our culture. That's happening at the very same time that other civilizations are strengthening economically and all these other things. So it's an interesting problem, isn't it, to have to think about and deal with.
I think it is, and I think it draws so many threads together. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating about all this, Aaron, is in one sense what we're saying and discussing here on the show today is nothing new. People have been saying this for a lot of time in kind of recent years, and also what I also find interesting is both Christians like ourselves and non-Christians are saying it. So actually, thinking back to my days at London School of Theology, where I did my undergraduate work in the 2000s, we had a wonderful kind of church history prof and cultural studies prof called Mike Pierce, who wrote an amazing book a few years ago called Why the Rest Hates the West. It's quite clever, actually. And that begins to pick up on this idea that, there's a lot in Western culture that means other parts of the world actually look on us as barbarians. which is a very eye-opening thing for a civilization that likes to think we are the bee's knees. Because of the way that we treat women, because of our sexual ethics and others. In many parts of the world, we are considered to be the barbarians at the gates, not the champions of everything. But obviously, Mike comes at that from a Christian perspective. But then more recently, I read, multiple kind of newspapers to try and get kind of balance. But, one of the ones I read at the slightly more, small c conservative end, the Daily Telegraph, Alistair Heath, who's a correspondent in there. Now, as far as I know, he's not coming at this from a Christian. Well, he's not coming at from the article I'm about to mention from a Christian perspective. Whether he has any faith of his own, I don't know. He doesn't give that impression in his writings. But he produced an article kind of recently called 4 Mega Trends That Condemn the West to Irreversible Decline. And we'll put a link to this in the show notes. And he says there are 4 things going on. He identifies there's the emergence of what he calls non-democratic capitalism. We in the West used to think that you couldn't become wealthy as a nation unless you embraced democracy. Well, hello, China have showed actually you can become fabulously wealthy without embracing capitalism, without embracing democracy. So that ship has sailed. The misuse of technology. He says the damage that social media has done to our political discourse, to our engagement with one another. I think we've forgotten how to communicate, and technology has wrought tremendous harm. There's this obsession with pursuing net zero when it comes to carbon emissions. Whole discussion around green kind of issues. But one of the comedy things, tragic comedy things going on is we in the West are probably going to really straitjacket our economic development, pursuing the chimera of net zero for carbon. And I say chimera because I don't think we're ever going to achieve it. I don't think it's actually achievable. It's perhaps a laudable goal. But of course, China and India and those civilizations go great. While the West ties itself up in knots, we're going to nick all of their best ideas. We're going to nick the green technologies they come up with as well. Thank you very much. But we're also going to keep building coal-fired power stations and develop like it's out of fashion. Yeah. And then lastly, he said, and we've touched on this a bit already, our kind of ideological decadence, that we don't really care about our values anymore. So those 4 things together form a kind of perfect storm. But we'll put a link to the article in the show notes. But Aaron, a question I have, we've talked around this a bit over the last half hour and diagnosed some of it. And in one sense, it's slightly like shooting fish in a barrel because, as I say, Christian commentators are picking up on this. Mentioned Mike, we mentioned Carl Trueman. Yeah. Recently, there are others, and say Alistair Heath. We talked about Tom Holland in previous shows. His book Dominion is quoted by Alistair in that article. But I suppose the thing I'd love is to think about for a few minutes. What do you think with your theologian's hat on? I mean, I'm a part theologian, but more of a kind of I suppose a communicator, an apologist, philosopher, evangelist, all those labels. But you're more of a purebred theologian. How do we respond to this as Christians? Because clearly, it's not right to sit there and go, we're all doomed, like what's his face from Dad's Army. There's a cultural product from a few years ago, the Scots guy, we're all doomed. Can't quite do that. But I don't think that's a Christian response. There's something, it's tempting, right? No. But I don't see that come through in Scripture. And boy, I mean, the first generation of Christians were faced with the Roman Empire and all the challenges there, but they don't sit in a huddle and weep. So how do we respond as Christians and perhaps avoid the opposite errors, either as sort of a Pollyannaism of saying there's nothing to see here, no problem, just move along, or we're all doomed. How do we respond to this?
That's really good. And let me just I always tend, whenever you say let's stop diagnosing, I always say, can I just have one more diagnosis, please?
Go ahead.
That's what theologians like to do. But let me try and weave it in. I'll try and weave it in together.
Weave into your answer.
So it gives me a chance to talk about Francis Schaeffer, because he's somebody who actually I think we need to start rediscovering in his approach. He's sort of got a bit dated for us. So Francis Schaeffer was a sort of cultural missionary of the mid-20th century, probably in the sort of 60s, 70s, towards the 80s. I think he died in the 80s. But he was very, very prominent in the 60s, in particular the 1970s, at diagnosing this problem of Western decline. But he saw it as a real missional endeavor. This was something the church needed to take up. So it wasn't just as easy as just saying, oh, look, either the world is doomed, or, oh, look, let's just create a Christian utopia or become fundamentalists or something. He was both against this sense of the church cutting itself off and against the church immersing itself so much in the culture that it lost its particularity. And at the time, there were no evangelicals who were doing what he was doing. There were plenty of liberals who would be talking about high art and culture and music and politics and law at the time. But there weren't too many evangelicals, because evangelicals tended to follow a little bit more of a separatist mindset and block themselves off a little bit. And I think he wrote this book, which I've discovered again recently. There's a load of videos they made in these mid to late 70s called "How Shall We Then Live," based on a book he wrote in 1976, where he was basically that. I think the subtitle was something like "The Rise and Fall of the West," but it's explicitly from a Christian perspective. It isn't just saying, "Look at everything that's gone wrong." It's saying this is actually a way to preach the gospel. So we can take the normal decline narratives, which we see everywhere, but actually Christians can talk about cultural decline in a way which points to not only why that decline came, for the things we've moved away from and that actually were a blessing to us as a culture, but at the same time point beyond the city of man, as it were, the city of humanity, or city of man in Augustine's terms, to the city of God. So there's an eternal city, that all of the cities on earth, all the cultures on earth that we glorify and speak of in such rapturous terms, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Persians, whoever, and we can look at wonderful cultural artifacts, wonderful philosophical and social inheritance that we get from these. And actually we can point those back to God and say, look, God is the one who created us in his image. He's the one who imbues us with dignity. He's the one who gives us this way, this light, as you say, that when we look at the world, we can see it in technicolor through the light of the gospel, rather than just seeing it through the lens of as though this was the only thing that mattered. And the reason I wanted to bring up Schaeffer's, especially because what he would do in these sort of videos he would do and the books he was writing at the time at his L'Abri, which is the sort of a place where he would invite seekers who had kind of given up on Christianity or complete atheists or agnostics to come and talk out their questions, come and question. And he'd do it by engaging with the kind of cultural tropes of the day, which is probably why no one read him for a while, because none of us know all that much about the latest things of the 1970s and 60s, as it were. But he would be doing things like there'd be seminars on the latest Beatles album and stuff like that, discussing and exegeting the lyrics and stuff like that, which was kind of an interesting thing. And I was thinking recently, looking at the woke kind of inheritance that we've got today, it does actually trouble me when I see some of the stuff that people like today, that even in their aesthetic judgments of what they think is good, or moral judgments, what they think is good, what they think looks good or sounds good, but also what sort of is good in its essence. I'm really quite troubled by the kinds of things that people seem to think are okay. I don't know if you heard of, here's where we'll really date this podcast in a few years' time. I'd only heard recently of this guy, Lil Nas X. Have you heard of him? Our listeners of Beyond of Certain Age. Oh,
no,
how could you not have heard of him,
the
Andy?
fact that I'm not, in with the in crowd now. I have.
Andy, I cannot believe you haven't. I mean,
I heard him. He's a theologian, right?
He is basically, he counts as a theologian now. Yeah, he's a rapper. He's the first open LGBTQI plus rapper. And he's kind of crazily viral, like 350 million people watching YouTube videos and this kind of thing, which is kind of phenomenal. I'd only heard of him yesterday, so you shouldn't feel too bad. I'm only a day ahead of you, culturally speaking. But some of the stuff in this video was genuinely troubling. Like, that 350 million people watched, and presume lots of whom liked this. And this is a lot of people of a younger generation. This is like the future of the Western kind of inheritors, as it were, of the culture. And it's like homoerotic, pornographic, satanic worship almost. Literally, like it's set in hell. It's like a descent into hell. It's so abject in its sort of trying to mock all of the ideals on which Western culture is built. It's kind of really fascinating to see, but also really, really troubling and disturbing. He's kind of become a real kind of leader to people. He's only like 22. You think, wow, this is amazing, really. This is the kind of icons of the day. There's a real shift in the kind of virtues that people look to. I'm not trying to say clearly that, let's say, the 1960s and 70s, weren't the Rolling Stones fantastic icons and role models? But there's clearly a shift in what people appreciate and what they're willing to tolerate that has changed. And people, it's normal for generations to look upon other generations and go, oh, isn't everything declining? Isn't it worse than when I was younger? So clearly we don't want to make that mistake, and Christians could easily do that just because the culture is like different. But I think there is definitely something here of almost like the essence of Romans 1, the sort of the God giving us up to our insanity, in our lusts, and our throwing away of truth, and our exchanging of the truth of God for a lie, and to kind of turning away from God and towards idolatry. I can really see that in some of the popular culture today. In a way, Schaeffer could see the same in his day, but he was trying to find ways of bridging that gap and saying, look, this is why things have gone wrong, because we've stopped believing in truth. We don't believe in reason anymore. Even Christians don't have a reason for why. They're not prepared to give a reason in that Peter phrase of 1 Peter 3:15, prepared to give a reason for the hope to which they're called. They just say, Jesus loves me, and that's great. And actually, he said, I couldn't believe this. I read this in Schaeffer recently. He said, I'm increasingly getting uncomfortable when I see the word Jesus. Now, Francis Schaeffer was a very conservative, by most people's standards, he'd be far more conservative evangelical than many today. And he said, I'm uncomfortable when I see the word Jesus touted around, because I know it's being used in a very irrational way. And you could almost exchange the word Jesus for Muhammad or Krishna or Mick Jagger, because it's just basically, it becomes a kind of idolatrous trope. It's really kind of a self-egotistical religion, and people just kind of go, well, I like Jesus, but I don't really know anything about why it's true. I don't even want to say why it's true. And equally, it leads us to a relativism further down the line. So we've got to be careful about recovering the truths of what we believe, and actually arguing for it, defending it, and seeing where untruth leads. Like, it's not just everything's equal. It's not like if you just leave truth and not care about it, culture will just happily keep going and reduplicating itself in positive ways. It actually won't. It will usually regress. It tends to do that, like a garden that isn't tended regresses. So does a culture. So there does have to be, so being salt and light in a culture, you mentioned that verse earlier, does mean trying to be a witness, trying to be the city on the hill that the church needs to be, of truthfulness where we see lies and where we see complete falsehood, and of course of being preservative where we see sort of rottenness there. And there's ways we can go wrong when we approach those issues, but I think we need to be really, really sharp and aware of them, which is why I think someone like Schaeffer's helpful to recover.
Yeah, I think I think as we said when we were prepping this podcast, that we're setting up so many like topics for future shows, and one of the things I'm encouraged by, I'm very grateful to all of you who listen, because looking at the stats, you can see that people like come across one episode and then go listen to other ones, and they're all designed to be timeless, because I think a lot of these themes interconnect. But a couple of things, like just by way of response to what you said there, I think the other reason I think it's important for Christians to keep an eye on culture, one of the things I think the mistakes we've made around the arts is that I mean, Schaeffer was a huge influence on me as a young Christian. One of the things I really appreciated was he took the arts seriously. And I think a lot of us today, Christians, if we're honest, sadly don't take the arts seriously. Either we turn our back on them totally and sort of think Christians shouldn't go there. Let's just have highfalutin, theological conversations and not think about the world of art. Or we just, engage, very naively. We sit there and watch, we listen to whatever music's on the radio. We watch Game of Thrones or whatever. And we don't actually think about the values and the issues that are going on there. And I think we forget how deeply art goes, because we're made as God has created us to be creatures of culture, and culture really matters. And there's a very famous quote, isn't there, often attributed to the 18th century Scottish politician Andrew Fletcher. It's a slight misquote of what he said, but the idea is right. He said, he's often attributed to him this quote, "Let me make the songs of a nation. I care not who makes its laws." And he was getting at the idea there that actually, culture, and he's writing this in the 18th century, right, is more influential than philosophy and theology and those other things. And so we neglect those things at our peril. And I think Christians have ceded ground. The other thing I guess I want to say is that it's very easy to take the example of that rap artist you mentioned and go, right, okay, let's train our guns there because look how depraved it is. I worry actually about popular culture. I'm going to probably win no friends for saying this, but you take Game of Thrones. I mean, I love fantasy and high fantasy and low fantasy as well. I steered so clear of that because if you look at some of the themes and the way they were portrayed, I got deeply disturbed by Christians going, "Oh yeah, I watch this stuff all the time." I'm like, do we not need to raise at least some questions, not to be prudish or Luddites or all those other things, but are going, the Bible does say deliberately, whatever is good, whatever is noble, whatever is right, think on these things. And then even more popular culture, there was a great piece, I think it was a magazine I was reading in recently, talking about Love Island. Look at the values built into that. We was talking about the number of young women now who are going for plastic surgery because that show has successfully sown the idea that if you need in order to succeed in life, you need breast augmentation, Botox in your lips, and to look plasticized, like that view of femininity. And there's a particular view of masculinity built into that show. But too often we sit there, remote control in hand, and we don't ask the kind of theological questions. And so it's such a hard balance to get right between being able to critique culture, but not also become doom and gloom merchants, but also, as I say, to be salt and light. And I love the fact that Jesus used those two metaphors together, Aaron, because salt and light are interesting, right? Light works at a distance. There's something about the gospel that works at a distance. We can try and bring light into a culture. We can try and help people see the difference between cats, to return to an earlier metaphor. We can be in the public square. But salt, of course, works very differently. In the ancient world, it's preservative, but it didn't work at a distance. There's no point having a bowl of salt on the other side of the room was your food. The two needed to come into contact. And as Christians, we need to come into contact. We need Christians who are in the arts. We need Christians who are in the world of television and media and wherever. And it's not easy. And I know Christians in those fields often feel it's very tough because they get attacked on both sides. They have their secular, very liberal friends attacking them. And then we have Christians saying, well, why are you working there? Why are you working at the BBC? And it's like, well, it's truth. If every Christian who is left vacated the BBC, what's going to happen? And so I think that salt and light passage is hugely helpful. But then one last thought, I'd love to throw this your way, because you and I talked about this. So let me back this your way and I'll stop rambling.
That's fine.
Get an evangelist on a monologue. They're going to keep going. One thing that I know you and I have also talked around a lot, and might be worth talking about for a few minutes, is the idea of the long defeat. Right, I know you. In fact, I think you had have a blog around that. That's an idea that comes out of Tolkien. So Tolkien in Lord of the Rings talks about the fact that particularly the elves, who have been around in that book, in that fictional culture for thousands of years, knowing that ultimately they're going to lose, but they don't give up. They fight what they call long defeat. And is that I do wonder, there's something about Christians in culture going, we know that the world is going to get darker and more difficult, and evil is not going to prevail, but it's going to look like it's triumph before the end will come. Jesus is very honest. There'll be wars and rumors of wars and false messiahs and all kinds of things. Jesus doesn't say, you know what, it's going to get better and better and better. Man, you guys have no idea. It's going to be utopia. In fact, so much so that when the second coming comes, you'll wonder why I've even bothered. No, Jesus says, no, it's going to get really, really, really bad. And then finally, God is going to intervene and wrap up history, for the sake of the saints. Have we forgotten that? Have we perhaps, are we so in love with our culture that we don't have that longer term perspective and realism? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. There's so much in there. I think obviously we could even do a whole episode on eschatology one day, because that would almost, you could think the difference between premillennial and postmillennial eschatology in terms of how we will see hope. But let's save that for another one. I'm sure Michael will be desperate to get in on that.
He absolutely will.
Save some stuff for him to talk about. He'll say, why are you guys getting so doctrinal? That's what you have to do. You have two doctors in the room, two fake doctors at a podcast. But so absolutely, the long defeat, and that was the reason my friends and I a few years ago, we set up this kind of team blog with that as the kind of leading mantra, as it diagnoses the tension that you're still fighting. You don't give up fighting, but you know that you're not going to win until he comes. And as soon as you start thinking we're going to win, we were trying to win now, I think you miss it, and you miss those really, really crucial trajectories in the New Testament, which talk about the city that is to come. Here we seek no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Our citizenship is in heaven. But of course, the famous, as Augustine had said in his City of God, that those who are most preoccupied with the heavenly city are going to be of best use in the temporal city. So it's not that we disengage, as you say, we have to be in the midst of it. And I want to sort of put a sort of, a kind of caveat to we definitely want to encourage Christians in the arts, but my only reservation would be, I've seen that for years as well, of people who, if they go there as their first point of call, that's what they're most excited about, because they're already worldly, or they're already inclined to that because they feel that they're an artistic person, and they're going to kind of moan about the fact that the church doesn't take artists seriously. Sometimes that can get quite melodramatic. And I say that as someone who would I call myself an? I did a master's in creative writing, so I would call myself a creative type, and I went to conferences on writing, Christian writers things back in the day, and there were people who were quite prominent Christian artists who had some secular acclaim, but had done loads of kind of Christian go-to theatrical stuff. And they would say things I just, at the time, I thought, this just sounds totally lopsided. They were saying things like, I don't believe, one quote was, I don't believe revival will come to the church until the artists return. And I'm just like, for goodness sake, do you really think that that's literally, that the Holy Spirit's just waiting to pour himself out? As long as those annoyed, melancholic artists return, then I could do a revival, because they could sort of help me sort of paint the pictures of it, or sort of express it in beautiful poetic words. You look at the history of revival, that's not actually how, even the Great Awakening, that's not how it worked. It was that certain people were completely transfixed with the eternal city, with the fact that goodness me, like, this is the point of life. All of life is leading to this. We're made in the image of God. We've sinned and fallen away. We desperately need God. And that must affect my everyday life, my personal life and my corporate life. And they live accordingly. And when they live accordingly, they do things which are quite striking. They might start preaching on the street. They might start planting churches all over the world, sending missionaries here, there, and everywhere, as the Western churches did all around the world, and bore wonderful fruit. That's what happens when God gets hold of people and gives them a vision that actually there's things that are more than just this culture. So I think we need to be aware, we want to be cognizant of what's going on. We need to be aware, thoughtful about the culture that's going on, but we're already so immersed in it ourselves. We need to also develop a habit of going, it's okay to withdraw and say, actually, I need to get some perspective. I need to actually be, we need to be the church, to be the city on the hill. It needs to be a bit on a hill sometimes, to be able to glow and look different to the world, because we're already so compromised. As you can see, the effect of a lot of the wokeness on churches has been quite significant, and so has the worldliness. You mentioned Game of Thrones. I think so many Christians while away so much of their time on Netflix, and think probably, if they had a caveat in their head, would be, well, firstly, this is downtime. This is fair enough, right? We all sort of need some relaxation time, and certainly not blasting leisure. And John Wesley didn't think much of leisure, so we shouldn't go too far. But there is a problem even in the kind of stuff you're taking in. Game of Thrones has all sorts of problems in it, but loads of the Netflix series, my wife and I sometimes try to watch a series that's more recent, just to kind of stay a little bit current, and sometimes just can't. It just gets so frustrated because I feel like I'm being preached to within the first episode. There's so much propagandizing of the ideologies of the contemporary West in so much of the culture of the West. So it's interesting that often those things become vehicles of the ideology in ways that I just think are so strange, that how that's happened so quickly. So we've got to be aware of that. What are we taking in? How are we interpreting it? Are we chewing and spitting out the right way? And are we then able to actually speak into what we have to kind of point people to, which is actually what they're looking for when they go for a Netflix binge or whatever it is, or whatever they're giving themselves to. So because we want to say that art should describe something true. So I think art, beautiful art, the best art which points to beauty, is because it's true as well. There's something we go yes in our spirit to, and we appreciate. And Christians have the answer to point them to the kind of fount of all truth. Jesus saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I bring light. I bring life and immortality to light, Paul says, through the gospel. And so we have that wonderful opportunity to do that, and we need to do that in and through the way we engage culture. Not just, hey, look, I've read some Greek poets. Look what Paul did in Acts 17. Let's just spend all of our time reading the Greek poets or the equivalent. I'm going to watch 15 Netflix series just so that I can know the Greek poets. Actually, Paul then calls them to repent, as we've said before. And so we need to diagnose it, be immersed in it, and then actually call it to repentance when it's required, which means calling people to repentance as well. So sorry, that's a ramble to the ramble, but you can.
No, it's good, but I think we probably need to draw this to a close before too long. And I think there's nothing else we've shown. There's a need for a whole podcast episode here, I think, on art and aesthetics. But one thing that struck me as you were talking there, Aaron, I wonder whether one of the reasons why we've gone a bit astray. Well, two reasons why we've gone astray when it comes to culture and art and so on. One is we talked about we've lost our values as a culture. We've lost the confidence in. And once you lose confidence in your values, and everything becomes personal preference, then you've got, of course, no framework to go, well, I'm sorry, that's not art. That's just disgusting. That's just dehumanizing or whatever. And so we've lost that cultural confidence. And it's interesting, we look at, the values that the BBC was, here in the UK was classically formed on. It was designed to both entertain, but also educate and edify, I think, was all in there. And we've, now, no sort of program commissioner at a big broadcaster would be sitting there thinking, well, how do we make sure that we grow people's character? That would not be there. It's all about eyeballs, and all values have become equal. But then also, I think, as our culture, and we've talked about this in previous shows too, as our culture has become desacralized and we've forgotten, what it means for there to be something bigger than just the material, I think art actually increasingly begins to not fit that, right? Because, on a purely Darwinian view of the world, where does art fit in? If we're just here to survive and reproduce, and even Dawkins, I think that, famous Oxford atheist, I think once described things like art as a Darwinian misfiring. It doesn't really fit that materialistic worldview. And also, of course, for art to point beyond itself to something bigger, which is built into the classical idea of art, that it's not just about, the picture is not just to make you go, oh, okay, that's a lovely picture. It's supposed to connect you to bigger themes of beauty and meaning and truth and virtue. Absolutely. But once you cut all that off, then all you have is your engagement with the piece itself. Everything becomes totally subjective and the whole thing collapses. And that obviously brings us back to Jesus, because for Christians, right, art has to connect. So if Jesus is the source of all that is good and all that is beautiful and all that is true, then when you see a beautiful piece of art or a beautiful landscape, whatever it is, it shouldn't make you just think that's a beautiful piece of art. It should make you think about the one who is the source of that. And C.S. Lewis talks a lot about this, right? About don't just look at the object of beauty, look along it to its source. And if you lose that idea, then very quickly, the rot spreads. But maybe that's a conversation for another time, eh?
Yeah. Well, I maybe we should just keep talking until Michael comes back.
To warn listeners, that could be a whole week. But I'm going to wrap it up because I can hear there's the beginnings of a riot building outside the door.
There'll be another dislocated shoulder, won't
there might well be, or one of those, I think it was episode 6 where my children made a very loud, interruption on the track and became almost part of the show.
You're just saying that to get bigger downloads for episode 6 now.
Let's go listen to that. Or has Bannister actually remembered correctly? Or was that indeed the episode where throughout the whole thing you could just, hear Michael stirring his sourdough?
That's true, yeah. That's right.
Michael is still with us. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope for everyone listening, it's been a fascinating conversation. One of the things I guess we're very conscious of at the Pod of the Gaps, aren't we? That we don't pretend to have all the answers. I hope we have some really good ideas about what the questions are, and the reason we construct these as conversations is, some of the stuff that we are thinking together out loud, and we hope it encourages folks listening at home, right, to begin thinking about this stuff and thinking more deeply, right?
Absolutely. I think it's also important, on the note of that. I heard recently, of course, you and Michael were saying we had a new patron subscriber, which was very exciting. So thank you to that wonderful person. Do we name people on here? No, we don't name.
We don't name and.
What if they give loads of money? What if they give like £100?
We could make that at support level. That if you give a certain amount of money to support the show, we will mention your name, and we could do it subliminally, like product placement. Or we can name parts of the show. We could go. This is the John Smith introduction, or the Rachel Jones punchline.
Or if you're an introvert, then the price is higher. Like you have to give a certain amount for us not to mention your name. So
but yes, it's the very serious point as we bring this to an end is, we're very grateful to everyone who supports the show. It's a small but select but growing number, and there's so many things we'd love to do with Pod of the Gaps in terms of promoting it, in terms of being able to get the resources to get it edited slightly better, in terms of getting some promotion behind it so it can get out more widely, and so on and so forth. So if you enjoy Pod of the Gaps, if you listen as you drive around the country or as you do your daily run or wherever it is you listen to Pod of the Gaps, do click on the link in the show notes to Patreon. And the great thing is you can sign up to support us for as little as £1 or $1 if you use that strange American currency a month, or higher if you want. It all makes a difference. It all helps cover our costs, and it all helps us grow this show so it can reach, inform, challenge and equip more people. But yeah, it's been great talking to you as ever, Aaron. And we're going to be in a brief break before the next episode lands, because I'm the next one off on holiday, going to the land of no Wi-Fi. But we will be back in a few weeks' time with another episode. In the meantime, thanks for listening and goodbye.
Bye.